I'm Blake, 28 years old. I moved out at 18, and after a decade of hard work, I finally bought my dream home, a place I could call my own and find peace. But I'm here to share a story about how that peace didn't last long once my family found out. It's a story about favoritism, sacrifice, and the lengths people will go to keep you tethered to old obligations you never signed up for. Growing up, I wasn't the favored child. That spot was firmly held by my younger brother, my parents' golden child. He was the one who could do no wrong, while I was there as his convenient runner-up. For as long as I can remember, my family dynamic was clear. If there was ever any competition for attention, privileges, or resources, he came out on top. A perfect example is what happened when I was 16. I was thrilled to finally get my own room upstairs. After years of sharing, that felt like a huge deal. But as soon as my brother turned 13, my parents decided he deserved that room. Their reasoning? He was growing fast and needed more space. Just like that, I was demoted to a cramped room in the basement with barely enough space to fit my bed and desk. That's when I realized that if I wanted anything in life, I'd have to work for it myself. So I focused on my studies and saved every cent I earned from part-time jobs. I wasn't going to rely on my family. By the time I was 18, I was out of there, heading to college on scholarships and the little bit of savings I'd built up. I kept in touch with them, of course, but it was always a bit distant. Enough to keep the peace, but not enough to get tangled back into that old web. Meanwhile, the golden child didn't exactly take the most productive path. After high school, he bounced from one thing to another without much direction or ambition. He moved back in with my parents pretty quickly. They weren't thrilled, but they never pressured him to get his act together. Instead, they provided endless excuses for him, saying things like, he's just trying to find his passion, or he needs time to figure things out. It was frustrating, but I stayed out of it, focusing on building my own life. Over the next 10 years, I worked my way up in my career. I was finally in a place where I could afford something special, a mansion, a true reward for all those years of pushing myself. It was everything I had dreamed of, spacious, filled with light, and best of all, entirely mine. For the first time in my life, I felt a true sense of accomplishment, but that sense of peace didn't last long. Word got back to my family, and almost immediately, I noticed a shift. It started with an unexpected call from my parents, feigning surprise over my purchase. They sounded almost shocked, as if they hadn't thought I'd ever make it that far. They congratulated me, but were quick to drop hints about wanting to see the place for themselves. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but I thought a brief visit couldn't hurt, so I invited them over for the weekend. When they arrived, it wasn't the warm visit I'd expected. The entire time, they walked around with judgmental expressions, nitpicking everything from the decor to my choice of furniture. My mother went as far as suggesting that the house was too big for someone living alone and hinted that it could be a family home if I ever wanted to welcome people back into my life. I tried to brush it off, thinking they were just adjusting to the idea of me having something this nice. But then they took it a step further. My dad brought up my brother's situation, casually mentioning that he'd been going through a rough patch and could use a break. He hinted that maybe my brother could stay in one of the guest rooms just for a while to help him get back on his feet. It was a bold suggestion, considering my brother had made zero effort to improve his situation in years. I couldn't believe they would ask me to open my home, my sanctuary, to the very person who'd always been handed everything I'd had to fight for. I immediately said no. I didn't give them an explanation, I just told them it wasn't happening. That's when my mother's expression changed. She launched into a rant about how they had sacrificed so much for me over the years, how they'd given me everything, and how they couldn't believe I'd be so selfish. It felt like they were blaming me for wanting to protect the one thing I'd worked so hard for. After they left, I thought the issue would settle, that they'd eventually understand. But a few days later, I received a letter in the mail, a long, emotional letter from my parents, urging me to reconsider and help family when they need it. They painted a picture of my brother as someone who'd fallen on hard times through no fault of his own and acted like it was my duty to step in. At that point, I knew I couldn't handle this on my own anymore. I decided to share my story online, hoping to get an outside perspective. The responses were overwhelming, with countless people urging me to stand my ground. It was the validation I needed to keep my boundaries intact. But my family wasn't ready to back down just yet. That letter turned out to be only the beginning, as they continued to push and test just how much of my life I was willing to hand over to make them happy. This story wasn't over. In fact, it was only getting started. Update 1. After I posted my story online, I thought that maybe my family would back off and realize I wasn't going to cave. But things got worse. It started with texts from my parents, one after another, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, asking me to reconsider and reminding me that family is all we have in the end. I ignored them, hoping they'd take the hint. But the messages kept coming, each one more desperate, saying that it was my duty to help the family after all they had done for me. When I didn't reply, they upped the ante. My mother sent a message about how ungrateful I was being and reminded me that they'd always shared their home with me. It was like she had forgotten I'd spent my teenage years in a cramped basement room so that my brother could have my old room. That one stung, but I still didn't respond. I could feel them trying to wear me down bit by making it seem like everything they'd done had been for my benefit. Finally, I decided to reach out to a few close friends to get their take. I wanted to make sure I wasn't overreacting by refusing to give in. Every single one of them agreed my family was overstepping. One friend even said it sounded like they only cared about my brother's comfort and were trying to guilt me into taking responsibility for his bad decisions. Another friend pointed out that they didn't seem to care about me until I got the mansion. Hearing this helped solidify my resolve, and for the first time I felt like I had a real support system outside of my family. But then I got a message from my brother, the first one in years. He'd never really reached out before, even during the holidays. His message was short, saying he was sorry for the past and asking if he could crash at my place just temporarily. No explanation, no acknowledgement of what he'd done, just a vague apology and a request. It felt hollow, like he was just saying what he thought I wanted to hear. So I replied with a firm, but polite no, explaining that I wasn't responsible for his choices. That's when the floodgates opened. Within minutes, he was firing off messages, accusing me of thinking I was too good for family, saying I was cold-hearted and selfish. He threw in every insult he could think of, calling me stuck up and saying that I'd forgotten my roots. I could almost hear the anger through his texts, and it became clear that this wasn't about needing a place to stay, it was about me not giving him what he wanted. Then my parents started calling. They left voicemails saying they were disappointed in me, claiming they had raised me to help family first. They even dredged up moments from when I was a kid, as if to remind me of all they'd supposedly done for me. I felt like they were rewriting history to make themselves look like the perfect, selfless parents, ignoring all the years I'd spent feeling like an afterthought. It crossed my mind to block them, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Despite everything, the idea of cutting them off completely felt extreme. Part of me hoped that maybe they'd realize they were pushing too hard and would back off on their own. But that hope quickly disappeared. The constant messaging started taking a toll. It got to the point where I was losing focus at work, checking my phone every few minutes in case another guilt-tripping text came through. My mind kept drifting back to everything they'd said, and I started wondering if maybe I was being too harsh. But then I'd read over my friends' texts, reminding me to stand my ground, and I'd feel a bit better. One afternoon, things took an unexpected turn. I was at work, focusing on a report, when my phone started buzzing nonstop. I ignored it, assuming it was another string of texts, but when I checked, I saw a missed call from the front desk. A few minutes later, one of my coworkers walked over, looking uncomfortable. She quietly told me that my parents were in the lobby, demanding to see me. I couldn't believe it. I hadn't told them where I worked, so they must have asked around or looked me up. I went down to the lobby, hoping to defuse the situation quickly, but as soon as I walked in, they started. My mother was on the verge of tears, loudly accusing me of abandoning my family, while my dad stood by, arms crossed, looking at me like I was some ungrateful stranger. They didn't care that people were watching. They wanted me to feel guilty, humiliated even. It was so loud that one of my coworkers eventually stepped in, asking them to leave. That didn't go over well. My dad said something about how they were there for family business and that I owed them. But the coworker didn't back down, calmly telling them that this wasn't the time or place for it, and asking them to respect the workplace. Reluctantly, they left, but not without a final jab. My mother called out that she'd raised me better than this, her voice echoing in the lobby as they walked out. I was left standing there, embarrassed and exhausted. My coworker put a reassuring hand on my shoulder, telling me not to worry about it, but it didn't make me feel any better. When I got home that evening, I knew I needed to update my Reddit post. I shared everything that had happened, the messages, the unannounced visit, and the public confrontation at work. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, with people encouraging me to stay firm and reminding me that family boundaries are important. It felt good to know I wasn't alone, that others had been through similar situations. Reading through the comments, I felt a new resolve. I couldn't keep letting them pull me back into the same cycle. This was my life, and I had to protect my peace, even if it meant standing up to the people who were supposed to love me the most. Update 2. After the incident at my workplace, things only got messier. My parents took their efforts to the next level, deciding to drag the rest of the family into it. I didn't expect them to go this far, but one morning I woke up to a series of notifications. My parents had posted a long, emotional message on Facebook, painting me as this cold, ungrateful son who had abandoned his family despite everything they'd done for me. The post was carefully worded, hitting all the right notes to gather sympathy from anyone who didn't know the full story. They wrote about the sacrifices they'd made, raising me with so much love and care, and mentioned how heartbroken they were that I refused to help them during this difficult time. They framed it like I was somehow required to step in, implying they had supported me financially well into adulthood, something that couldn't be further from the truth. My phone started buzzing almost immediately. Messages from extended family poured in, filled with confusion, judgment, and disappointment. A few were simple, asking what's going on, but most were direct accusations, telling me I was selfish, asking how I could ignore my family after all they'd done for me, and calling me out for forgetting where I came from. The worst part was that these messages weren't just from people I barely spoke to, but also from relatives I had once been close with, who were now ready to take my parents' side. My parents' posts spread fast, and soon even distant cousins I hadn't seen in years were messaging me, taking shots without any real understanding of the situation. My aunt, who'd been particularly close to my mom, messaged me saying she couldn't believe I'd put my family through this. They were all rallying around the story my parents had put out, where I was the villain who'd turned his back on his own family. As the messages poured in, I considered posting my side of the story, but I hesitated, worried that it would come across as petty or even escalate the drama further. My parents' post had been public, and it already felt humiliating enough without adding to it. So I decided to wait and see if the storm would die down on its own. When I shared all this with my friends, they were just as shocked as I was. They kept telling me to ignore it, to let people think whatever they wanted because anyone who really knew me would understand. But as supportive as they were, the pressure from family only seemed to grow, and my resolve started to waver. Every day brought another round of messages reminding me of how important family is or implying that I was responsible for my parents' suffering. Then my parents took things a step further. They started reaching out to old family friends, people who had known me as a kid but had little to do with my adult life. My parents told them the same story they'd spun for the family, portraying me as abandoning them in their time of need. Soon enough, those family friends were reaching out too, echoing the same guilt-laden messages I'd already been getting from relatives. The more this went on, the angrier I became. It felt like no matter what I did, they'd keep pushing until I gave in. But the idea of giving in, after everything they'd put me through, felt like a betrayal of everything I'd worked for. I couldn't let them guilt-trip me into opening my home to someone who'd never even tried to help himself. At that point, I started to seriously consider going no contact. I knew it would be hard, but it was starting to feel like the only way to get my life back. I'd been holding out, hoping they'd back off, but the social media post was a line crossed, and I didn't see them turning back. So I made a final decision. I blocked my parents and my brother on every platform, deciding that enough was enough. But I didn't want to leave things without any closure, so I posted a short, calm message on my own social media, explaining that I needed privacy and that I wasn't going to discuss personal family matters online. I didn't go into details, I just set the boundary and left it at that. The responses were mixed. Some family members messaged to say they understood and respected my decision, but others weren't as supportive. A few even left passive-aggressive comments, hinting that I'd changed or lost my way. It hurt, but I knew I couldn't keep bending over backward to make everyone happy. At the suggestion of a friend, I decided to look into counseling to help me process everything. I found a therapist who specialized in family dynamics, and during our first session, I could tell it was going to help. We talked about setting boundaries and the importance of prioritizing my mental health, things I'd always struggled with around my family. But just when I thought things might settle down, my parents sent me another message through a distant relative, implying they might take legal action, claiming I owed them for years of support. The idea that they could even think of something like that was absurd, but I couldn't ignore it. I updated my Reddit post, sharing the latest developments, and the response was incredible. People offered support, shared similar stories, and some even advised on legal steps I could take if things escalated further. With each new comment, I felt a little stronger in my decision to keep the boundary I'd set. My therapist encouraged me to keep focusing on myself, to remember that this was about protecting my peace, not about revenge or anger. It helped knowing that I wasn't alone, that others had been through similar situations and had found ways to come out stronger. The family pressure may not have ended, but I knew now that I had the tools to handle it. This wasn't just about standing up to my family, it was about finally taking control of my own life. Update 3. Just when I thought things couldn't get any messier, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a lawyer representing my parents, demanding repayment for years of support and living expenses. The whole thing read like a joke, but they were serious. They had actually put together a list of supposed expenses they'd covered for me, with inflated numbers attached to each item, dating all the way back to when I was a kid. It was absurd, especially since I'd left home at 18 and had been self-sufficient ever since. I knew then that I needed legal help to put an end to this nonsense. I hired a lawyer to go over the letter with me. After looking at everything, my lawyer confirmed that my parents' case held no legal weight. In fact, they couldn't legally claim any of these so-called expenses as debt I owed. However, my lawyer warned me to stay cautious. My parents might try to push further, and it would be wise to have some documentation ready if things escalated. On my lawyer's advice, I started digging through my old records, gathering proof of everything I had financially contributed to my family over the years. It turned out I had given them more than I'd remembered, including money I'd sent home during my college years when my parents claimed they needed help with bills. Then, just when I thought I'd covered every base, I received another nasty message from my brother. He accused me of tearing the family apart and claimed that my pride was going to ruin everyone's lives. He went on about how I was too good to help family, calling me selfish and greedy. It was clear he had no understanding of how much I'd already sacrificed and worked for on my own. Ignoring him didn't make things easier, but I refused to be pulled back in. Surprisingly, an unexpected message from a cousin came through shortly after. She had seen the fallout on social media and reached out privately to let me know she understood what I was going through. She shared that she, too, had been on the receiving end of my parents' favoritism toward my brother. As it turned out, she had distanced herself from them years ago for similar reasons and was supportive of my decision to set boundaries. Hearing from her felt like a weight off my shoulders, and it sparked a ripple effect I didn't expect. After my cousin's message, a few other relatives who had once kept their distance from my family started reaching out to show their support. They remembered instances of favoritism and said they'd noticed how my parents had always treated my brother differently. Some even apologized for not speaking up sooner, admitting they'd been unsure of how to help. Slowly, the public narrative my parents had tried to build began to crumble. Extended family members who initially sided with my parents were starting to see things more clearly and stopped jumping to conclusions. But my parents didn't take this shift well. They doubled down, making another lengthy Facebook post claiming I was lying about my childhood and rewriting history to make it seem like I owed them everything. They were trying to paint themselves as the perfect parents who had done everything for me, twisting the narrative again to rally sympathy. But this time, fewer people were buying into it. Meanwhile, one of my childhood friends reached out after seeing the mess unfold online. We hadn't spoken in years, but he remembered the favoritism all too well. He even brought up specific incidents he'd witnessed when we were kids, reminding me that my memories weren't exaggerated. Hearing this from someone outside my family was reassuring, giving me more confidence that I wasn't overreacting or misremembering things. Then, my cousin shared something else that changed my perspective. She told me that a lot of my brother's financial problems were due to reckless spending, not just bad luck as my parents had claimed. He'd been living beyond his means, racking up debt on unnecessary expenses. My parents had spun his situation as though he'd fallen on hard times, but it became clear he'd made those choices himself. They'd been covering for him while trying to guilt me into stepping in to save him from his own mess. With my lawyer's help, I gathered all the documents I'd need if things escalated. They reassured me that my assets were protected from family interference and that I was in the clear legally. Knowing this took a huge weight off my shoulders. It allowed me to start focusing on myself again, instead of worrying about the latest family drama. In counseling, I reached a turning point. My therapist pointed out that I'd spent my whole life feeling like I had to earn my family's love, like I was constantly trying to prove my worth. For the first time, I began to let go of that need and focus on building a life where I didn't need anyone's approval but my own. Just as I felt a glimmer of peace, my parents tried another tactic. They called my workplace, trying to get me in trouble. Fortunately, my boss was aware of the situation and dismissed them without giving them any information. Later, my boss pulled me aside to make sure I was okay and assured me they wouldn't tolerate anyone harassing their employees like that. After everything that had happened, I felt a sense of clarity. My family had tried every way they could think of to manipulate guilt and even legally threaten me. But none of it worked. For the first time, I felt truly free from their influence, as if a door had finally closed. I shared an update on Reddit, detailing the latest drama and expressing my gratitude for the support I'd received. The community's responses flooded in, with people offering even more encouragement and legal advice, which I took to heart. The outpouring of support and shared experiences helped solidify my decision to stand firm, knowing I wasn't alone. It had been a long, painful process, but I was finally at a place where I could see a future free from their control. And for the first time, I felt like I was truly in control of my own life. Update 4. Just when I thought things couldn't escalate any further, my parents took it to a whole new level. One evening, I logged into Facebook to find a public post from them, laying out every complaint they had about me for the world to see. They claimed I was cutting them off after they had raised me single-handedly, going on about sacrifices they'd made, and insinuating that I owed them for their investment in my future. It was a mess of accusations that painted me as the ungrateful child who had turned my back on the very people who'd made me who I was. The comments section was just as ugly. Extended family members were split, with some defending me and others siding with my parents, going on about how family loyalty should come first. The people who sided with my parents were furious, acting as though I owed them some kind of inheritance payback, claiming my success was only possible because of the opportunities my parents had supposedly provided. Then, as if things weren't chaotic enough, my cousin reached out with a bombshell. She shared that my parents were facing serious financial trouble, and much of it had been caused by their own poor decisions. Apparently, they'd been relying heavily on my brother, the golden child, to turn his life around and help them financially. But his reckless behavior and spending habits had only made things worse. They'd pinned their hopes on him, despite knowing he wasn't responsible or reliable, and now, with no one else to turn to, they'd decided I was the next best option. With this new information, I started going through all my old financial records, determined to find proof of every time I'd contributed to them in the past. I was able to uncover receipts and records from years back, showing that I'd sent them money for things like utility bills or groceries during my college years. These weren't huge amounts, but they were proof that I'd contributed more than they ever acknowledged. Having this record helped me feel even more justified in setting boundaries. Things weren't calming down, though. Every day brought a new wave of messages from relatives, either berating me or telling me to make things right with my parents. I leaned heavily on my close friends during this time. They reminded me that I wasn't obligated to fix the financial mess my family had created, and that I had every right to live my life without being dragged into their drama. Their support kept me steady, especially as the situation grew worse. Then I found out my parents had taken things even further by contacting authorities. They'd filed a complaint, accusing me of elder neglect, saying I had a duty to support them financially and was failing to do so. The authorities looked into it briefly but dismissed the case almost immediately. They told my parents that I wasn't legally obligated to support them, and that this was a family issue, not a legal one. Hearing this was a relief, but it also showed me how far they were willing to go. But the biggest shock came in the form of a message from my brother. He sent an ultimatum, demanding I give him one of the guest rooms in my mansion for as long as he needed it, saying it was the least I could do after all he'd put up with growing up. He acted like he was entitled to a permanent place in my home, framing it as though he'd done me some kind of favor just by being my sibling. It was clear he hadn't changed one bit and had no interest in making things right. I took this message to my lawyer, who suggested I start taking further precautions. He recommended that I install security measures around my home, just in case, and begin gathering evidence in case I needed to pursue a restraining order. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but I realized these were steps I had to take to protect myself. The next day it happened. My parents and brother showed up uninvited at my property, standing outside the front gate and demanding to be let in. They were loud enough to attract attention, yelling about how I was abandoning them, and that they had a right to see me. I didn't want a confrontation, so I called security. Security asked them to leave, but my parents argued, saying they were family and that I had to let them in. When security escorted them off the property, they made a scene, drawing the attention of my neighbors. After they finally left, a few neighbors came over, offering words of support. They'd seen the whole thing, and some even told me they'd had similar experiences with entitled family members. It felt good to have people around who understood, who didn't judge me for standing my ground. Later that night, I updated Reddit on everything that had happened, sharing how things had spiraled and how far my family was willing to go to try and guilt me into submission. The responses were overwhelming, with hundreds of people sharing advice, sympathy, and even legal tips on how to protect myself from further harassment. Some users shared similar stories, showing me I wasn't alone and that others had found ways to get through it. In the middle of all this chaos, I took a step back and thought about my family dynamic from a distance. It became clear that my brother had likely been a pawn in all of this, a way for my parents to create a system where they had complete control. They'd set him up as the favored one, giving him everything without responsibility, while pushing me into the role of the family's financial backup plan. But now, after years of manipulation, that setup was falling apart, and they were left scrambling. I finally felt a sense of resolve. It was time to end this once and for all. I wasn't going to let them control my life, and I was done playing the role they had forced on me. I shared a brief, clear post on my own social media, stating that my boundaries were final and asking for privacy. I explained that I had no ill will but needed to focus on my own life and peace. The fallout from that post was immediate. Some family members reached out with support, while others doubled down on their criticism, but I was ready for it. I knew this was the right choice for me, and for the first time, I felt free to move forward without looking back. Update 5. The situation with my family had gone further than I ever expected, and I knew I had to make a permanent choice to protect myself. After their unannounced visit and public scene, it was clear that I could no longer rely on simple boundaries. They were determined to push their way into my life, and I was done letting them. I spoke with my lawyer, and we decided it was time to file restraining orders against my parents and my brother. I never thought I'd get to this point, but their behavior had left me with no other option. The restraining orders were filed swiftly. My lawyer explained the process, and I followed every step, hoping it would finally give me the peace I'd been seeking. Having these legal protections in place felt like a weight had lifted. I knew they wouldn't be able to just show up at my home or workplace anymore. At the same time, I realized I needed to cut off every other form of access they had to me. I made the decision to go completely no contact. I reached out to the few relatives who had supported me, letting them know that I'd be taking this step. They were understanding, expressing sympathy, and offering their continued support. Some even promised to keep their doors open if I ever felt the need to reconnect. It felt good to have this small circle of family members who respected my boundaries. To ensure my peace, I blocked my parents, my brother, and any other family members who had been unsupportive on all social media platforms. I also asked my close friends and coworkers not to pass along any messages or updates from my family. If my family tried to reach me, I wanted it to end there. I didn't want any back and forth or updates on their lives. I needed a clean break. Next, I took steps to protect my finances. I moved my funds to a secure account and added extra protections to ensure no one could access them but me. With my lawyer's guidance, I made sure that my assets were shielded from any future interference. It was a strange thing to think about, but I knew my parents' desperation could drive them to try anything. By taking these precautions, I finally felt secure. I updated all my emergency contacts and passwords, making sure my family couldn't get through any loopholes to reach me. For the first time, I felt fully in control of my own life and privacy. Then came a final message from my brother. He managed to reach me one last time through an unblocked number, accusing me of destroying the family and saying I was the reason everyone was suffering. His message was full of anger and desperation, but I didn't respond. It was clear that he hadn't changed and was still clinging to the narrative my parents had built. Ignoring the message was hard, but I knew engaging would only drag me back into the chaos. In the days that followed, I finally started to experience real calm. There were no more messages, no more unexpected visits, no more guilt trips. My home, once filled with tension and dread, became a true sanctuary. I spent my mornings enjoying coffee on my porch, my evenings unwinding without the constant pull of family drama. My space finally felt like mine. Counseling became a place of closure and reflection. In our sessions, my therapist and I talked through everything that had happened, and I began to see how setting boundaries had transformed me. I'd started this journey with a sense of obligation, feeling like I needed to be there for my family no matter the cost to myself. But now I understood that protecting my peace didn't make me selfish. I was finally building the confidence and independence I'd always been denied. With my family no longer a distraction, I turned my focus back to my career. I accepted a new project at work, one that challenged me and reminded me why I loved what I did. My boss, who had seen a bit of what I'd been through, was supportive and gave me the chance to lead the project. That sense of accomplishment, of focusing on my goals without the emotional toll of my family weighing me down, felt liberating. I also began expanding my social circle, spending more time with friends who truly supported me. I met new people, built connections, and started filling my life with relationships that felt genuine and uplifting. These people celebrated my successes and offered real support, the kind I'd never felt with my family. It was a new feeling, one that I welcomed with open arms. Even some extended family members reached out, telling me they respected my decision. They acknowledged my family's behavior and assured me that they'd be there if I ever wanted to reconnect. It was a relief to know I didn't have to lose everyone to find peace. These relatives became a source of quiet support, people who understood my journey and stood by me without judgment. I posted a final update on Reddit, expressing my gratitude to the community. The support I'd received from strangers had been an anchor during some of my darkest moments. Reading their words, hearing their similar stories, and knowing that others had been through this kind of family struggle made all the difference. I thanked them for their advice, encouragement, and the strength they'd unknowingly given me. With this chapter closing, I started to think about my long-term goals. My life was finally my own to shape, without anyone's demands or expectations pulling me in different directions. I began planning for the future, dreaming of new places to travel, projects I wanted to take on, and the kind of life I wanted to build. For the first time, I felt excited about the possibilities. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I took a deep breath, letting go of the past. This journey had shown me what true independence looked like, and I knew I'd never go back to the life I'd left behind. I had finally closed the door on my family's hold over me, choosing a new path defined by self-respect, independence, and strength. I'm a 30-year-old guy, and I thought my life was finally getting on track. I moved out of my parents' house 7 years ago, started living on my own, and have been working my tail off to make ends meet. Rent, student loans, bills, you know the drill. But today I stumbled upon something that completely threw me off. It all started when I visited my parents' place last weekend. Nothing special, just a regular Sunday lunch, which I try to do at least once a month. My younger sibling, who's 27 now, wasn't there, which isn't unusual. They've always had a more free-spirited approach to life, which usually translates to them being somewhere on vacation or just hanging out with friends. They've always been able to live pretty comfortably, which is something I've low-key envied for a while now, but I just assumed they managed their money well or had better luck with jobs than I did. Anyway, after lunch I hung around in the living room while my parents cleaned up in the kitchen. I noticed some papers on the coffee table, which isn't unusual. My mom likes to leave bills and other documents scattered around, but this time, one of the papers caught my eye. It was a bank statement, and without even thinking, I glanced over at it. What I saw almost made me drop my drink. The bank statement wasn't for my parents' account, it was for my younger sibling's account. The part that floored me was the consistent, large deposits being made into their account, and all from the same source, my parents. There were amounts of money that I couldn't even imagine getting from them. Thousands. And these deposits were regular, like clockwork. Every month for the past 2 years. I felt my stomach drop. I moved out when I was 23, and at the time, my parents made it very clear that once we were adults, we were on our own financially. No more handouts, no more support, just pure independence. I accepted that and took on the responsibility of paying my own way through life. It's been tough, really tough. I've had months where I wasn't sure how I'd pay rent, months where I lived off ramen noodles because that's all I could afford. I've worked long hours, missed vacations, and declined invitations to hang out with friends because I just couldn't afford to do anything outside of work and home. Seeing those deposits on the bank statement, it felt like a punch to the gut. I stood there for a minute, staring at the paper, trying to process what I was looking at. Why was my sibling getting all this money? What made them so special that they got this kind of support while I was left to fend for myself? I put the paper back down quickly as I heard my parents coming back into the room, but I couldn't focus on anything else for the rest of the visit. Driving back to my apartment, my mind was racing. I kept replaying all the times my parents praised me for being self-sufficient, like it was some badge of honor. I'd always believed them when they said they were proud of me for making it on my own. But now it just felt like they were saying that to avoid having to help me. Meanwhile, my sibling was living it up with their financial cushion, new clothes, trips abroad, even a new car last year. I couldn't help but think back to every time I'd asked for a little help, even just a small loan to get me through a rough patch. My parents always told me, we all have to make sacrifices, or you'll figure it out, you're strong. They made it sound like we were all in the same boat, struggling to make ends meet. But clearly my sibling was in a much nicer, well-equipped boat than I was. And it wasn't because they were better at managing money or had a higher-paying job. My parents were literally funding their lifestyle. It all started making sense now. I'd always been a little jealous of my sibling, but I chalked it up to them being more carefree, more adventurous, maybe a bit luckier in life. But now, it was crystal clear. The vacations, the new clothes, the car, it wasn't luck. It was mom and dad's money, handed over to them quietly while I was left struggling. My sibling and I have never had the best relationship. Growing up, it was clear they were the golden child, always getting a little extra attention, a little more understanding. I guess that's normal in some families, but it always bugged me. And now this was too much. I tried to remember the last time I had dinner with my parents. My dad had mentioned how proud they were of me for being independent, how I'd made it on my own. They said it like it was an accomplishment, like I was a success story. Meanwhile, my sibling, who apparently hasn't even been trying to be independent, was getting a monthly allowance from them. It felt like such a betrayal, like all the struggles I'd gone through meant nothing. By the time I got home, I was fuming. But I also felt trapped. How do you even bring something like this up without blowing up your entire family dynamic? I mean, I know I need to confront them, but the thought of it makes me sick. I'm angry, sure, but I'm also confused. Why wouldn't they tell me about this? Why was this all a secret? And most of all, how am I supposed to keep pretending everything's fine when I now know the truth? I'm seriously at a loss here. I don't want to cause a family meltdown, but I can't just let this go either. If anyone has any advice, I'd love to hear it. Update 1. After reading all the advice on Reddit, I decided it was time to confront my parents about what I found. Most of the comments suggested I keep calm and have an honest conversation with them, face to face, rather than letting my emotions get the better of me. It made sense. I didn't want to blow up on them and regret it later, so I spent the next few days thinking about how I'd bring it up. I rehearsed what I'd say, listed out the points I wanted to make, and made sure I stayed focused on the facts. The plan was simple. I'd visit them on a quiet afternoon when I knew they'd be home and just lay it all out. I was going to tell them how hard it's been for me financially, how I've struggled for years thinking they weren't in a position to help, and then ask why they've been giving money to my sibling without ever mentioning it to me. When the day came, I showed up at their house, mentally prepared for the conversation. Everything was going according to plan until my sibling unexpectedly showed up. I didn't plan on confronting them with my sibling there. This was supposed to be between me and my parents. I wasn't sure what to do. For a minute, I thought about waiting for another time, but something in me snapped. I was done keeping this inside. So even with my sibling sitting in the same room, I went for it. The atmosphere shifted the second I brought it up. I asked directly, "Why have you been giving money to my sibling every month for the last 2 years?" There was no build-up, no hesitation. I just wanted answers. My parents were caught completely off guard. You could see the shock on their faces. My mom fumbled for words, looking at my dad like she hoped he'd say something to defuse the situation. But he was just as stunned. The room felt thick with tension. At first, they denied anything was out of the ordinary. My mom was the first to respond, trying to brush it off by saying they've always treated both of us equally. But I wasn't having it. I knew what I saw. That bank statement didn't lie, and there was no way to spin it. Before I could say anything more, my sibling jumped in, defensive right away. They accused me of overreacting and being jealous, which just made everything worse. I wasn't expecting them to go on the attack like that, and honestly, it just fueled my frustration. This wasn't about jealousy, it was about fairness. I had worked my ass off for years thinking we were all on the same page, only to find out they'd been getting a financial safety net the whole time. After the initial awkward denial, my dad finally admitted it. He said they'd been helping my sibling because of unexpected expenses. That's all he offered. No details, no explanations, just vague excuses. I couldn't hold back anymore. I told them how hard I've worked, how many times I've struggled to make rent or pay my bills, and how it felt like I was being left out in the cold while they gave handouts to my sibling. I didn't want to seem ungrateful, but I was furious. Why was I told that financial support wasn't an option while my sibling got thousands of dollars every month? My parents tried to justify it, saying that my sibling just needs more help right now and that I'm doing fine on my own. That comment sent me over the edge. Fine? I'm barely keeping it together most months, and they've never once asked if I needed help. I reminded them of all the times I hinted at needing support or directly asked if they could help me out, and each time they told me, we all have to make sacrifices. Then, as if to rub salt in the wound, my sibling doubled down, saying I was acting entitled, like I deserved something just because they were getting help. The whole thing escalated fast. We started shouting over each other, all the pent-up frustration from years of feeling like the lesser sibling pouring out. My parents didn't know how to handle it. They kept trying to play mediator, but it wasn't working. At one point, my mom broke down. She just started crying, which was out of character for her. She said there was more to the story, but she refused to tell me what it was. That was it. I couldn't take any more. I felt like I was being kept in the dark about something huge, and no one was willing to be honest with me. I grabbed my things and left. I didn't say anything as I walked out the door. I could hear my mom calling after me, but I couldn't turn back. The whole situation felt like a nightmare. I didn't know who I could trust anymore, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever look at my family the same way again. When I got back to my apartment, I felt completely drained. Nothing was resolved, and in some ways I felt worse than before I confronted them. I thought maybe having the conversation would give me some clarity, or at least an explanation, but instead I was left with more questions than answers. What was this more to the story that my mom mentioned? Why didn't they ever come to me with the truth from the start? I jumped back on Reddit and updated the thread. I poured out all the details, hoping someone would have some insight on how to move forward. Part of me was hoping the Reddit community would have answers since my own family clearly didn't. At this point, I felt like I was grasping at straws, trying to make sense of the mess I'd just walked into. Update 2. A few days after the blow-up at my parents' house, I was still trying to wrap my head around everything that had happened. I hadn't reached out to them, and honestly, I didn't expect to hear from them anytime soon. So when my phone rang and I saw it was my mom calling, I was surprised. I hesitated for a moment, but then answered. She asked if we could meet, just the two of us. She wanted to talk without my sibling around, which caught me off guard. We agreed to meet at a cafe in the middle of the week. When I arrived, she was already sitting there, looking nervous. I hadn't seen her like this in a long time. It was obvious that whatever she had to say, it wasn't going to be easy. As soon as we sat down, she jumped right into it. She told me the real reason they've been giving my sibling all that money. It wasn't just for unexpected expenses like my dad had said. The truth was much more complicated. My sibling had racked up a huge amount of credit card debt, thousands of dollars, and had also developed a gambling problem over the past couple of years. They were drowning in debt and apparently had been borrowing money from all kinds of sources to keep themselves afloat. My parents had stepped in to help, but they didn't want to tell me because they were afraid it would upset me, and they thought my sibling would be embarrassed. I was stunned. I had no idea my sibling was in such deep financial trouble. Sure, I always thought they were a little careless with money, but this? Gambling? Credit card debt? It was completely out of left field. As I sat there, I couldn't believe that all of this had been going on behind my back while I was left struggling with my own financial issues. But what really hurt was that my parents didn't trust me enough to tell me. They'd been keeping this huge secret for years. My mom explained that they never meant to keep it a secret forever. They were just trying to handle things quietly, hoping that my sibling would get back on track before it all spiraled out of control. They didn't want me to feel like I needed to step in or get involved. In her eyes, they were protecting both of us, helping my sibling without burdening me. She said my sibling's pride had a lot to do with it, too. They didn't want anyone to know they needed help, so my parents were trying to be discreet. Hearing all of this, I could understand why they did what they did, but that didn't take away the sting of betrayal. I told my mom that while I could see why they wanted to protect my sibling, keeping me in the dark like this wasn't fair. I had been under the impression that we were all trying to make it on our own, and I'd been killing myself working long hours, thinking there wasn't any help available for me. Meanwhile, my sibling was getting thousands of dollars handed to them, and I was left to figure everything out alone. The trust I had in them, in the fairness of our family, felt broken. My mom apologized, admitting they should have been more upfront with me from the start. She said they never meant to hurt me, but they were trying to handle a difficult situation the best way they knew how. She said that my dad still believed I didn't need the help as much, that I was strong and independent, and that's why they focused on my sibling. That was hard to hear, especially knowing how much I've struggled over the years. I felt like no matter what I did, it was never going to be enough to change their view of me as the one who doesn't need help. I asked about my sibling. Did they know the full extent of the support they were getting? My mom shook her head. Apparently, my sibling didn't even realize how much money my parents were sending them each month. They thought it was just enough to cover the bare minimum, but in reality, my parents had been covering their debts, bills, and even some extra spending. It was like my sibling was living in a bubble, unaware of how deep the hole really was. As we talked, I could feel the distance growing between me and my family. My mom's honesty was a step in the right direction, but it didn't fix the fact that I felt like an outsider in my own family. They'd kept this massive secret from me, and even now, with everything out in the open, it didn't feel like things were going to go back to normal anytime soon. The divide between me and my sibling was bigger than ever, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted to try to mend it. When I got home, I turned to Reddit again, hoping to get some advice on what to do next. Should I try to rebuild my relationship with my sibling, knowing now what they've been going through? Or should I just keep my distance and focus on my own life, like I've been doing all along? A lot of people commented with different opinions, some saying I should give my sibling another chance, others telling me to walk away and protect myself from more heartache. As I sit here now, I'm torn. Part of me wants to reach out to see if there's any way to fix the damage, but another part of me wonders if it's even worth it. The trust is broken, and once that's gone, how do you rebuild it? I don't have an answer yet, and I'm still trying to figure out what the right move is. But for now, I'm keeping my distance, trying to process everything, and decide what kind of relationship, if any, I want to have with my family moving forward. Update 3. Not long after my meeting with my mom, the inevitable happened. My sibling found out about the conversation. I'm not sure if my mom told them directly or if they overheard something, but they called me out of the blue, demanding to know why I'd gone behind their back to talk about their financial situation. It was clear they were upset, and before I could even get a word in, they accused me of blowing everything out of proportion. They claimed I didn't understand what was really going on and made it sound like I was the one stirring up trouble. That phone call turned into another family confrontation, this time with all 4 of us involved. I went back to my parents' house, and it didn't take long for things to escalate. My sibling was adamant that I had misunderstood everything. They insisted that their financial issues weren't as bad as I was making them out to be. They downplayed the credit card debt, saying it was under control, and completely denied having any gambling problem at all. It felt like I was standing in front of a brick wall, trying to explain why I was upset, but nothing I said seemed to get through. The tension was thick. My sibling accused me of being jealous and of trying to make them look bad in front of our parents. That comment set me off, and before I knew it, we were shouting at each other. I called them out for living in denial about their finances, while they fired back, blaming me for being judgmental and unsupportive. The room felt like it was about to explode. My parents tried to step in and mediate, but it was clear they didn't have much control over the situation. Every time they tried to calm things down, my sibling would dismiss them, saying they were fine and didn't need help. My mom, looking exhausted, kept saying she just wanted peace between us, but it wasn't working. My dad sat there quietly, clearly uncomfortable, but I could tell he still wasn't willing to admit that my siblings' problems were as bad as they were. Finally, after what felt like hours of going in circles, I couldn't take it anymore. I told my siblings straight up. Either they come clean about the full extent of their financial mess, or I was done. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine while they kept lying to everyone, including themselves. I said I needed honesty, or I was walking away from the relationship entirely. I meant it, too. I didn't want to keep enabling them, and I couldn't watch my parents continue to throw money at a problem that wasn't being solved. That's when my sibling broke down. At first, it was just frustration, but then the floodgates opened. They finally admitted the truth. The credit card debt was way worse than they had been letting on, tens of thousands of dollars, not just a manageable amount like they had claimed. And yes, the gambling was real. It had started small, but over time it had spiraled out of control, and that's why they had been relying on our parents' financial help for so long. They confessed that they had been hiding the worst of it not just from me, but from our parents too. They didn't want anyone to know how deep the hole really was. The room went silent after that. My parents were visibly shaken, and I could see the guilt written all over their faces. They had been enabling this, thinking they were helping, but in reality, they were just making things worse. My mom started to cry, and my dad finally spoke up, saying they should have handled things differently. They admitted that they had been too lenient and that they hadn't realized how bad things had gotten. My sibling just sat there, looking broken, and for the first time it felt like we were all on the same page, at least about the seriousness of the situation. Despite feeling vindicated in some way, I also felt heartbroken. It was hard to realize just how much my sibling had been struggling, and even harder to know that they had been hiding it from all of us. At the same time, I couldn't shake the resentment I felt from being left in the dark for so long. I didn't want to hold on to that anger, but it was there, lingering. After things calmed down, we talked about moving forward. My parents were willing to help my sibling, but this time there were going to be conditions. We agreed that my sibling needed to go to therapy for their gambling addiction, no exceptions. My parents also decided to stop handing over money without a clear plan in place. We came up with a strict financial plan that would cover only essential expenses, and my sibling would have to stick to a budget moving forward. My parents asked if I would help my sibling manage their finances, and I reluctantly agreed. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I also didn't want to abandon them now that everything was out in the open. I made it clear, though, that I wasn't going to get sucked into their problems. I'd help with budgeting and making sure they were on track, but only under the condition that they fully committed to getting help and staying on course. Any slip-ups, and I was out. We ended the conversation on a hopeful note, but I'm still cautious. My sibling agreed to the therapy and the financial plan, but part of me wonders if they're truly ready to make the changes they need to. I've seen how deep their denial can run, and I'm not sure how long they'll stick with the program before they start making excuses again. For now, we have a plan in place, and I'm doing my best to support them without getting too involved. I updated Reddit again, asking for advice on how to balance helping my sibling while protecting my own mental health. Most people have told me to keep my distance, set firm boundaries, and not let myself get dragged down if things go sideways again. I'm going to do my best to follow that advice, but it's not easy when it's your family. I just hope my sibling can turn things around before it's too late. Update 4. After everything blew up during the family confrontation, things didn't magically get better, but we tried to move forward. My sibling, after some reluctance, started attending therapy for their gambling addiction. It wasn't easy convincing them, but with the agreement in place that my parents and I wouldn't offer any more financial help unless they took real steps to change, they finally gave in. For the first few weeks, they actually stuck with it. I kept my emotional distance, though, because I didn't want to get too involved and be disappointed again. I took on the task of helping my sibling with budgeting, which was a whole different beast. It was frustrating from the start. Every time I'd lay out a plan for them to follow, they'd find ways to skirt around it. They'd claim they needed something urgent, and before I knew it, they'd spent money on things that weren't even remotely essential. It was like every other week they'd blow through their budget, and I was left wondering if they were even taking this seriously. I'd ask them about it, and they'd brush it off like it wasn't a big deal, insisting they were trying their best. But it didn't feel like they were. Things got worse when they started missing therapy appointments. I noticed they skipped a few, and when I asked why, they said they were too busy with work. I wasn't buying it. This was supposed to be their top priority, and it felt like they were just making excuses again. That's when I started really questioning whether they were committed to fixing their life or just doing the bare minimum to keep getting help from us. My parents, meanwhile, were still financially supporting them, though they claimed they were sticking to the essentials-only rule. But even that didn't seem like it was helping my sibling learn financial independence. They had no real sense of money management, and every time they ran out of funds, my parents were right there to fill in the gaps. I could see the cycle continuing, and it made me wonder if any of this was actually going to change. It felt like we were just repeating the same mistakes over and over. The more this dragged on, the more frustrated I became. My siblings started splurging on things again, new clothes, nights out with friends, little luxuries that weren't necessary. It drove me up the wall. I knew my parents were still giving them money, so I confronted them about it, asking why they were letting this continue. My sibling denied any wrongdoing, acting like I was overreacting and making a big deal out of nothing. They claimed they were still trying, but I didn't see any real effort. I started to feel like I was being gaslit, like I was the only one seeing the truth, while my parents and sibling just played along in this broken system. My parents, of course, downplayed the whole situation, telling me to be patient and give my sibling more time. That only made things worse between us. I felt like I was being painted as the bad guy, the one who was being too hard on my sibling, when in reality, I was the only one holding them accountable. The tension in the family was unbearable. My parents and siblings seemed to be on the same side while I was standing on the outside, looking like the villain for simply wanting my sibling to take responsibility for their life. As if that wasn't enough, my job started getting more demanding, adding another layer of stress to everything. I was juggling a million things at once, dealing with work, trying to help my sibling with their financial mess, and managing the growing strain in my family. It was emotionally exhausting, and I felt like I was being stretched too thin. Then came the breaking point. My sibling had a particularly bad week and confessed to me that they'd fallen back into gambling. They were ashamed, but the damage was done. They'd racked up more debt, and once again, came to me and my parents asking for help to cover it. I was furious. This wasn't supposed to happen again. I had tried everything to keep them on track, and now they were back to square one. It felt like every effort I'd made was pointless. At that moment, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I told my sibling that I couldn't help them anymore, unless they made a real commitment to change, no more missing therapy, no more blowing through budgets, no more excuses. I laid it out clearly they had to stick to the plan, or I was done. My sibling broke down, begging for another loan to cover the new debt, but I refused. I wasn't going to throw more money into the pit if they weren't willing to take responsibility for themselves. My parents weren't happy about it. They thought I was being too harsh and couldn't understand why I wouldn't give my sibling another chance. But I stood firm. I knew that enabling my sibling would only make things worse. It hurt to see my family disappointed in me, but I couldn't let this cycle continue. It was time for some tough love, whether they liked it or not. I turned to Reddit again, explaining everything that had happened and asking for advice on how to handle the fallout. The community was overwhelmingly supportive of my tough love approach, and they reinforced that setting boundaries was necessary, not just for my siblings' recovery, but for my own mental health. It gave me the reassurance I needed to stay firm in my decision. Now, I'm trying to move forward, keeping those boundaries in place. I want to believe my sibling can turn things around, but I'm not getting my hopes up just yet. They've made promises before, and I've seen how quickly things can unravel. For now, all I can do is focus on myself and hope my sibling finally realizes they have to be the one to change. Update 5. After I refused to lend any more money to my sibling, they stopped speaking to me. At first I was hurt by the silence, but I knew deep down that this distance was probably necessary. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the wake-up call they needed to finally take control of their life. It wasn't easy though. The guilt lingered in the background, and every time my phone buzzed, I half expected an apology or a plea for help, but nothing came. Despite my tough love stance, my parents continued to enable my sibling, sending small amounts of money here and there. They tried to justify it, saying it was necessary for their recovery, but I knew better. I could see that they were still stuck in the same cycle, unable to say no, and it infuriated me. I felt powerless. Every time I confronted them about it, they brushed it off, making me feel like the bad guy for refusing to help. I was reaching my breaking point. The combination of work stress, family drama, and feeling like I was the only one holding my sibling accountable was wearing me down. I started to wonder if I needed to step back from my parents too. The constant back and forth was draining me, and I couldn't keep carrying the weight of their decisions on top of everything else. I wasn't responsible for fixing my sibling's life, but it felt like I was the only one who truly understood that. At the advice of Reddit, I decided to seek therapy. I realized that I had been carrying way too much responsibility for my siblings' actions. The guilt, the frustration, it was all piling up, and I needed an outlet to process it. Therapy helped me see that I couldn't fix everything, and more importantly, that it wasn't my job to do so. I had to set boundaries, not just with my sibling, but with my parents too. Not long after I started therapy, my sibling hit rock bottom. They lost their job after relapsing into gambling again. This time, there was no hiding it. The situation was laid bare for my parents to finally see just how bad things had gotten. With no income and mounting debt, my sibling couldn't keep up the facade any longer. My parents were forced to confront the reality of the situation. They'd been enabling this behavior for far too long, and now it was time to stop. We all sat down for a serious family intervention. This time, my parents were on board. There was no more coddling, no more handing over money without accountability. We laid down strict conditions, mandatory therapy, complete financial transparency, and no more loans. If my sibling wanted our support, they had to prove they were willing to change. It wasn't a negotiation, it was an ultimatum. My sibling, backed into a corner, reluctantly agreed to the terms. They knew that without our help, they risked losing everything. Even with their agreement, I couldn't shake the skepticism. I'd seen this pattern before. Promises to change, followed by half-hearted efforts. I wasn't convinced that they were truly committed, but for the sake of my own sanity, I had to let go of that burden. I made it clear to my parents and my sibling that I wouldn't be dragged into any more financial crises. I needed to focus on my own life, my career, and my mental health. From that point on, I put distance between myself and my family. I took a step back from the constant drama, choosing to focus on my own healing. For the first time in a long time, I prioritized my well-being over trying to save everyone else. My sibling was now fully responsible for their own recovery, and while I kept an eye on things from a distance, I refused to get too involved. My parents struggled with the new boundaries. They frequently reached out to me for updates on my siblings' progress, almost as if they wanted me to step back into my old role of managing the situation. But I stayed firm. I reminded them that they needed to respect the boundaries we had set, and that I wasn't going to be the middleman anymore. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the only way to protect myself from getting sucked back in. A few months later, there were signs of real progress. My sibling started attending therapy regularly and sticking to the budget we had set up. They were actively looking for a new job, and for the first time, they seemed to be taking their recovery seriously. I remained cautiously optimistic. I'd been burned too many times before to fully let my guard down, but it was hard not to feel a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things were turning around. Eventually, my sibling reached out to me. They apologized for how they had treated me during the whole ordeal and asked if we could start rebuilding our relationship. I agreed, but I made it clear that trust would take time to rebuild. I wasn't going to dive back into things as if nothing had happened. We both had work to do, and I wasn't going to sacrifice my boundaries for the sake of pretending everything was okay. Over time, I noticed a shift in our family dynamics. My parents weren't as financially involved in my sibling's life anymore. There was a sense of accountability that hadn't been there before. My sibling was finally taking ownership of their choices, and my parents, while still involved, were starting to let go of their need to constantly fix things. Therapy played a huge role in helping me get to this point. It gave me the tools I needed to establish boundaries and focus on my own happiness, instead of getting consumed by family drama. I can't stress enough how important that was for my mental health. I shared my experience on Reddit, encouraging others in similar situations to seek professional help if they were feeling overwhelmed. Looking forward, I know things aren't perfect, but I'm grateful for the progress we've made. My sibling still has a long way to go, but they're on the right path. And as for me, I'm learning to let go of the things I can't control, focusing on my own well-being, and keeping a healthy distance from the chaos.